let's get into our first topic now. Should we house channel migrants in warehouses? 0207862 2222. Get your calls in now. The Home Secretary Yvette Cooper said it's something the government is considering when she spoke to LBC's Nick Ferrari yesterday.
We do also want to see alternative sites, more appropriate sites, including looking at military and industrial sites.
But is it a warehouse?
Right,
is an industrial site a warehouse?
There are a range of different things that we're looking at.
Well, can you give me an example, Home Secretary?
Not yet.
Why?
And I will do so as we've got more progress on this, because
So you're looking at something, you and your colleagues are looking at something, and you've no idea of the example of what it might be. Let's look at industrial sites, Home Secretary. That's a good idea, and no one knows what it is.
We will provide you with more updates when we've got
But is it a warehouse?
Practical progress. That's one of the things that's been looked at, but we will provide updates when we've got the practical plans.
OK, so detail not hugely forthcoming, but Alys, the idea of taking industrial sites, warehouses, and them being used to house migrants, I mean, in your head, the way the pictures look, it's a hellscape, isn't it? Putting people in areas which are just designed for machinery.
I mean, look, I think it's pretty clear that the communities that are living alongside asylum hotels have had enough of this. I think it's clear that the asylum hotels are inappropriate accommodation. I think they're also an inducement to migrants to come here to be put up in a 3-4-star hotel. You can't just dump a bunch of single young men in a community in a seaside town where a hotel might otherwise be used for tourism. So the current status quo is not acceptable. But I agree with you. The idea of putting them in warehouses is slightly alarming. We've had the experience of putting them on the Biddy Stockholm, where one migrant died by suicide, and then they all had to be evacuated for Legionnaire's disease. It proved very expensive and not workable. So I think, obviously, we want to be looking at alternative styles of accommodation, but of course it has to be safe, of course it has to be humane, and of course the Home Secretary is absolutely right that we want them to be there as short as possible. We want to be speedy, we want to be reducing the number of people who are waiting to have their asylum claims decide them as quickly as possible, so they either get deported or moved, if their asylum application is granted, into much more suitable accommodation with proper support.
I mean, the thing is about hotels, they are purpose-built accommodation. It is actually meant for people to live in. I mean, I can't imagine that...
Well, it's not meant for people to live in. I mean, that was the basis of the court case that Epping brought against
habitation.
The whole basis on which they originally run this court appeal was that this was a planning application, that this was not appropriate accommodation for people to live in short term. I mean, if it was they were only there for a week or so and then they moved on, I don't think the communities would be so worried about it. But they're there for, it takes almost a year to decide an asylum application. It's not appropriate.
Well, I mean, it's been used as emergency accommodation for homeless families for much longer than that, for years and years.
Well, surely homeless families deserve much better accommodation than that. I mean, there's a whole sign of how broken the system is, that the number of asylum seekers is then therefore putting pressure on housing waiting lists for other people.
Yasmin, is the word warehouse the sticking point here? Because, I mean, let's face it, Manchester is full of luxury apartments that were once warehouses. If you choose to do the right things...
No, I'm not going to answer that question, because actually... Yvette Cooper did not say we're going to put them into warehouses. OK, she said we're thinking about options. There are three things to say on this. I agree with a lot of what Alys has said, but I think we should actually be very careful of some of the truths here. At every demo, more or less, at least that I know of, where protesters gathered, and some of them were local and many of them were not, they were inciting hatred. There were twice, sometimes 3 times as many demonstrators who were defending migrants. The media has been very, very careless about this. So Barbican, Thistle Hotel, for example, I went, briefly, because just 2 weeks ago, there were 250 demonstrators against those people. 800 people turned up to say, actually, we should be treating these people better. So that's point number one. Point number two is the hotels were a bad idea. Hotels were always a bad idea. They're too expensive. The people in there hate it. The asylum seekers hate it, for all kinds of reasons. I think there are better solutions. When Ugandan nations, where my background is, when they came, a lot of work was done to transform empty army barracks. And they were actually really decent places to temporarily stay, while you got yourself sorted. The Nightingale hospitals, Boris's Nightingale Hospital, why not the empty church properties? There are alternatives. But what revolts me is the dehumanization of human beings. They're human, like me and you.
Which is why I'm saying that we can see industrial buildings repurposed very effectively.
I wouldn't agree with that.
Honestly, it's happened in Manchester. We have seen Manchester former warehouses turned into beautiful apartments.
Are they going to put them into those apartments?
Isn't that just down to the will? Isn't it just down to the will to do it properly and the investment in something not short-term, like a Nightingale Hospital, for instance, which will be there and gone, but actually saying, if we look at what people's needs are in this moment and properly repurpose these buildings, this is a perfectly acceptable
But the Nightingale
solution.
hospitals were never used. OK, they're good buildings. Actually, I've seen a couple of them. They were never used. But so they can be repurposed.
But they were built to protect people from losing their lives.
Yeah, but they're good buildings. So why would you choose warehouses and not the Nightingale hospitals, which was the worst idea the Tories came up with and spent a fortune on?
OK, I think we're arguing at cross purposes. I think we're effectively saying choose the right building in the right situation.
And make it
I'm just
habitable.
saying, is the word warehouse a problem here? Is it just that?
Yes.
Because actually warehouses can be repurposed. We've seen it.
But they're not going to do that, are they? They're going to shift the population from hotels, and they haven't got the time to repurpose warehouses. Whereas I think the Nightingale hospitals, the empty church properties, can be made habitable far quicker.
OK, let's just take a look and remind ourselves of some of the options we've looked at as accommodation. So Oxford University Migration Observatory said at the end of the first quarter of 2025 that 62% of migrants were housed in dispersal accommodation. That means flats and houses in the community, whether it's social housing, whether it's private rented. 30% were in the hotels that we're talking about. There are a small number in detention centres, and that number fluctuates hugely. Now, we are saying Yvette Cooper hasn't ruled out the idea of warehouses, industrial buildings. Reform UK has suggested tents, which we've seen over in France as well. And we know, as Alys mentioned, the Bibby Stockholm was a floating centre, which the Tories tried, but it was quickly shut down after traces of the Legionella bacteria were found, and one man died, thought to have taken his own life. And that's the reality, the difference between an existence, Alys, and a life, a sustainable idea, because you do not know how long an asylum application is going to take. For somebody to be in these environments long-term means proper investment of time and money. They can't be done overnight, and they do have to be habitable. Otherwise, you get one story or another. A, they're living in luxury, or B, it's utter squalor. Those stories, we know that's what the media is going to play with.
Well, yeah, but I kind of disagree with your premise there that these people have to be in this kind of accommodation long term. Surely what we want to stop the abomination that's happening in the Channel, to stop people dying, to stop people risking their lives, is to break the link between the idea that if you just step one single foot on British soil, you get put up in whatever kind of accommodation here long term. We need to be deporting people who come here as quickly as possible. I mean, I remember going to the Calais jungle camp and seeing the kind of squalor people were living in there. And no wonder they wanted to cross the Channel, knowing that instead of living in a tent, in a ramshackle, unhygienic, you could come here and immediately be put up in a hotel.
OK.
No, I don't think that's the way it works. I think that's a really unfair way of putting it. That's a very unfair way that those people are thinking, I'm going to go and stay in a hotel. These are desperate people, absolutely, and they have to be processed.
Let's take a call.
Yes,
Phil,
processed
let's
as
take
quickly
a
as
call.
possible.
Phil's in North Yorkshire. Phil, what do you think of the idea of warehouses being used to home Channel migrants?
Well, as was said before about the Nightingale hospitals, we seem to have got rid of thousands of hospital beds, and the warehouses didn't look like warehouses when they were being set up. And then there's also all these empty big shops, the big shops that could be turned into accommodation.
How do we avoid the sort of scenes that we have seen, though, Phil, outside hotels? If you imagine a disused supermarket in a city or town centre, why is that less of a focus for protests and disruption than the hotels that we're seeing, for instance, the Bell in Epping?
Because straight away it's nail on the head. They're not hotels. They're not hotels. They would be put in position for the migrants. We put in position for people that were poorly at the time, as I can't remember names, but one lady says they're desperation. They've never seen hospitals.
But at least hotels are there provided, so you've already got sanitary provision there, so you've got loos, you've got bathrooms. You go into a supermarket, you've got none of that. You're starting with a blank slate, and you have to put all that stuff in.
But they must have it in the Nightingale hospitals. They had beds in 3 or 4 different cities for 500 people each.
OK. Do you think that the Nightingale Hospital, which, as you say, many of them not used, lay empty the whole time.
Never used.
Can you see that transposing and that kind of technique working for what we're talking about as an alternative to hotels?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
The Nightingale Hospital model that we saw used for patients, does that work as a way to house migrants?
Well, yes, no, we can use those hospitals for starters, and you can turn empty big buildings into good habitation, you know. But remember, it's never easy to be in this situation where you arrive in a country and actually they're not here to stay in, and they're not 4-star hotels. All this kind of mythology that has been developed, OK? I think you could do this more humanely and fairly, and as Alys said, and then create an efficient process system. So we don't, but you know what? At the moment, the hatred against these people that most people have never seen, never heard, I've met a lot of them. Okay. I once met a child, 8 years old, who was in detention, not that long ago, who had stopped speaking, who was not speaking anymore. OK. OK? We have to remember them as human beings.
We have to leave it there. We have to move on. Yasmin, Alys, thank you. Later on.